Just ahead on Focus, 2017 marks 100 years since the United States entered World War I. As American troops joined the fight, Lehigh Valley companies, Bethlehem Steel and Mack Trucks, supported the war effort with vehicles, guns, artillery, and ships. Meanwhile, the Allentown Fairgrounds transformed into a military base known as Camp Crane. We show you who trained there and why, coming up with this special Focus on History, World War I. Focus is for our community.
Focus showcases the people,
The places, and the issues that matter to you.
Focus on what matters.
You never know what you're going to see when you tune into Focus.
Support for Focus is provided by Univest, Banking, Insurance, Investments, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Focus. I'm Laura McHugh. It's been 100 years since the United States entered World War I, and on this anniversary, we look back with historians at what happened in the Lehigh Valley during this pivotal period in world history. We begin in Allentown with Focus reporter Grover Silcox.
Thank you, Laura. Before the United States entered World War I, many Americans volunteered as ambulance drivers and field personnel with French infantry units as the bloody conflict wore on. In 1917, the United States Army Ambulance Service was created to formally train ambulance drivers and personnel. It located the perfect site for its training center, the Allentown Fairgrounds. An arrangement was made and the fairgrounds transformed into Camp Crane.
After more than 150 years, people still line up at the box office for tickets to the next show at the Allentown Fairgrounds. But 100 years ago, a whole different crowd came calling as the U.S. Army transformed the fairgrounds into Camp Crane, an Army base for training ambulance drivers for service with the French infantry in World War I.
The French government said we really need ambulances and medics.
The French had been fighting the Germans for 3 long years and needed help getting their wounded from the battlefield to aid stations.
The United States Army Ambulance Service was formed to meet that function primarily in France.
The Army eyed the Allentown Fairgrounds as a great location for training the medics and the ambulance drivers.
The fairgrounds were located in Allentown's West End, a sparsely populated section of the city at the time. Recruits went on long and countless marches through rural towns and countryside just minutes from the camp. The U.S. Army leased the fairgrounds from the Lehigh County Agricultural Society for $37,000 a year, less than half the revenue typically generated by the fair.
Literally, the Army took over the Allentown Fairgrounds.
This was in May of 1917. About a month later, they had opened up and had their first recruits from Philadelphia already training.
So the Great Fair went on hiatus while Camp Crane trained ambulance drivers and personnel. Recruits and staff became known as USACs, an acronym that replaced Service for Corps.
In that 2-year time, 18,000 troops were on the fairgrounds and 2,000 officers were there.
Eager volunteers poured into Camp Crane from all over the country. Many came from more than 40 colleges and universities.
When you think about Camp Crane, it was almost a city unto itself. They had everything that they needed there. The grandstands were like a dormitory.
Seats in the grandstand were replaced with cots to create makeshift barracks. Men also slept in the fair's barns and sheds and throughout the fairgrounds in pup tents. Under the grandstand, where the farmers market is today, restaurant facilities became Army mess halls.
There were kitchens on either end of the mess hall, and the mess hall held 2,500 at a time.
The Army built other buildings on site, including a $125,000 steam plant to heat the various facilities. The USACs practiced driving on the half-mile harness racing track in front of the grandstand, and they used the infield for parking.
They were trained actually in a variety of ways. They need, first of all, to learn how to drive, how to get men properly into the ambulance.
They picked up a living person and knew that to the extent that they could rapidly get them to a field hospital or a base hospital, that would often mean the difference between life and death.
The USACs used Model T Fords modified for use as ambulances. Recently, World War I researchers Dr. Jeff Klinger and George King brought a model they had helped restore to the America on Wheels Museum in Allentown.
The ambulance that we have here today represents 1,200 ambulances that were donated by Americans and driven by American volunteers during the first 3 years of World War I, before the United States entered the war, and thus before Camp Crane. Although the Camp Crane ambulances looked exactly the same because they were also Model T Fords.
It's small, it's agile, it's light, it's relatively easily repaired, and it's designed to carry 3 individuals. Try to imagine, even loading it, 3 individuals on stretchers.
The men learned to repair the ambulances in difficult conditions. They also trained for gas attacks, a big threat during World War I. The training was rigorous, but it wasn't all work and no play.
The band that formed, it was constantly parading, and they were very good musicians. And they invited John Philip Sousa to come and listen, and reportedly he did.
The USACs formed a winning football team.
The troops had 15 All-American college football players.
The 1917 Army-Navy game was canceled because of the war, so the USACs played the U.S. Marines instead. Chester Delvey Lewis, who was stationed at Camp Crane, writes about it in a letter to his dad.
We won the Army-Navy game of 17, and our camp claims the best football team of the world. We bar no one.
Many, many different sports, lots of movies they could go to, singing, many things to keep them entertained.
The people of Allentown gave the USACs a hero's welcome.
The YMCA was so important here and actually had a presence on the grounds. The YWCA had a hostess area. The Knights of Columbus had a recreation building for the troops.
Lots of parades here at the time. You know, soldiers returning home, lots and lots of parades.
Our story is part history, part World War I, part old car, and a message, how can I give something back to my town, my state, my country, the world?
As 467 USACs did when they volunteered their service and gave their lives to save others in World War I. For Focus, I'm Grover Silcox reporting.
Thank you, Grover. As we continued our research, Grover learned that even before the United States joined the fight in 1917, American industry played a key role in supplying war materials to the Allied powers, including 2 Lehigh Valley companies in particular, Bethlehem Steel and Mack Truck.
Before the American doughboys of World War I climbed out of their trenches and into the fury of German firepower, Bethlehem Steel had been supplying the Allies, France and Britain, with artillery shells and munitions.
Bethlehem Steel produced about 20 million shells during the war.
Artillery proved the most lethal of all the devastating weapons used in World War I.
Battle of the Somme, in 6 days the British fired 4 million shells, which were ineffective because the Germans had dug down, and then when the British attacked with 150,000 men, they took 57,000 casualties in 1 day, killed, wounded, and missing. And then the Battle of the Somme lasted for 6 months, and on both sides there were 1 million casualties, and nothing was gained.
Shortly after the war broke out in August of 1914, Britain and France contracted American companies for war materials.
Industry plays a role in the First World War beyond anything that had previously been seen, simply because of the amount of logistics, the sizes of the armies, and all of the weapon systems that could now be deployed.
Bethlehem supplied 40% of the ammunition that America made.
They also manufacture gun barrels. The Americans are fortunate. We have the 1903 Springfield rifle, which is a bolt-action rifle of exceptional quality. They made rifle barrels also for the Browning automatic rifle, which was one of the weapons favored.
According to Dr. John Smith of Lehigh University, Bethlehem Steel produced 60% of the guns America made during the war.
But what is important to note is the French and the British had enormous government-run munitions operations.
American industry helped the Allies beat back the Germans from taking Paris in 1914. Afterwards, both sides became entrenched along a 435-mile front that ran from the North Sea to the Swiss border, primarily through northeastern France. This became known as the Western Front. Each side shelled the other mercilessly, and demand for weapons and munitions transformed companies such as Bethlehem Steel into industrial giants.
By the end of the war, Bethlehem's total assets had increased at about quadrupled in 4 years. And at that point, they were the third largest industrial company in the United States. They cleared about $150 million in profits during the war.
Charles Schwab, president of Bethlehem Steel, saw his personal wealth increase as well.
Schwab personally made about $20 million, and because Schwab had put in a 2% of profit bonus for his top executives, the New York Herald in September of 1915 reported that all 14 of Schwab's boys were now millionaires.
The steel stock rose rapidly through the war.
In 1907, one share was $8, and by 1916, $700 a share. Can you imagine that?
Even still, Bethlehem Steel earned a reputation for organizing war production and making high-quality products in record time.
Quality control was a big thing that Bethlehem Steel had in their favor, and that's what allowed them to win so many government contracts.
America entered the war and joined the Allies on April 6, 1917, after Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare on our merchant ships.
In 1917, the Germans had 66 U-boats, which sunk 2,600 ships, 700 which were American.
While America's young men went off to war, America's women filled their jobs at home. Many of the munitions produced by Bethlehem Steel were made by women through the war.
You do see more women being brought in, particularly for fine manufacturing.
They hired women. There were large numbers of women who were lathe operators. There were actually about 38 separate machining steps that it took to make an artillery shell, and women did a lot of that work. It must have been quite an incredible beehive of activity with 25 or 30,000 people coming into that plant every day.
In addition to guns and munitions, Bethlehem Steel became the major U.S. builder of warships and submarines.
In April of 1918, President Wilson asked Schwab if he would take over the whole American shipbuilding effort. And they turned out a lot of ships.
In response to the German U-boat threat, the U.S. Navy developed the convoy system, in which ships travel in groups to protect one another.
When we look at American troop transports, for instance, of the 2 million men who are sent to France, only 56 of them die from a U-boat attack.
Back on land, another product of the Lehigh Valley kept Allied troops moving: Mack trucks. The British were already using them when the Americans joined the fight.
America sold 150 Mack trucks to the British in 1917, and that's where the British engineers called them bulldogs.
The blunt nose, the hood shape, and the front cross member, kind of like a jowl type configuration, reminded them of their tough English bulldogs.
At the time, Mack operated as a partnership with two other companies under the name International Motor Company. During the war, the Allies used the Mac AC and AB models.
The AC model was a heavier version, which was produced at a later date than the AB model. It was overbuilt, so to speak. It was designed to do a job plus.
They were really instrumental because it was very difficult to get that amount of supplies to the front from the ports on the French coast. The railroads didn't always extend to all areas of the battle line, so Mack trucks really were used for that purpose, to get all that material up to the front.
The Mac was also used after chemical attacks.
Mac AC was fitted with a portable shower unit to allow soldiers to decontaminate after a possible gas attack.
When the United States went in the war, they ordered thousands of Mack trucks to go to the front. World War I's kind of the coming out party for the truck.
The U.S. Infantry, also known as the American Expeditionary Force, led by General John Blackjack Pershing, met the enemy for the first time at the Second Battle of the Marne River in France in July 1918.
We think about the machine gun, right, as the ultimate weapon, but it was the shelling. It was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They had the shells, and they just kept firing them all the time.
More than 2 million American soldiers joined the Allies in pushing back the Germans and forcing them to surrender at the Treaty of Versailles on November 11, 1918.
The Allies had overwhelming superiority over the Germans.
The Germans surrendered as U.S. forces were preparing for a big offensive the following year in January of 1919.
That was the actual date where they had their deadline set for full-scale production of war material from the United States factories. Obviously, the war ends before then.
According to Dr. Smith, World War I really wasn't the war to end all wars, as it became popularly known.
World War II was just World War I Part 2. The sad thing is, you know, we won that war, but unfortunately the peace turned out to be terrible.
Companies like Bethlehem Steel and Mack Truck organized their war production to meet the demands of the worst war fought up to that time. It was fought to make the world safe for democracy, but it failed to keep the peace. 23 years later, Bethlehem Steel, Mack Truck, and other U.S. companies would once again answer the call to arms in the fight to make the world safe for democracy in World War II. For Focus, I'm Grover Silcox reporting.
With me is Dr. Randall Miller, a history professor at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. And we're going to talk about the consequences of World War I. But before we do that, how did the war get started?
That's a very complicated question, but to give you a shorthand of it, there were a series of promises, in some cases alliances, made by various European powers. So when they had the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in the Balkans, this set off, it actually triggered a series of responses. Austro-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The Serbs were Slavs. The Russians wanted to protect the Slavs. They came in, and all these obligations kicked in, and all of a sudden what was a local incident that could have been handled diplomatically rapidly expanded and exploded into what became a world war. And it literally was a world war. It was not confined just to Europe, which itself was sufficient, but it spread, it affected Africa, it affected Asia, it affected the South Pacific. And of course, in the United States in 1917 is going to become directly involved in the war, although we had become involved in some ways even before then.
In America, how did it change things like technology?
The real technological changes in terms of the war were ones that we didn't so much generate as we were affected by them in terms of what was happening in the war. Some new applications, one might say, for domestic uses, like barbed wire, which is intended to keep cattle in the Great Plains and what have you, were being adapted now for trench warfare. And of course, the machine gun had already been developed, which affected the whole dynamics of warfare, giving it what's called a tactical advantage to the defensive. Once you were entrenched and you had barbed wire and you had machine guns, it was very difficult to overrun the other side, which is one of the reasons you had these mass slaughters. We're talking about millions of people dying here and bogged down in this trench warfare. And then the technological changes, the tank, greater use of aircraft, of course, terrible things, chemical weapons, all that sort of thing. So when we think about technology in the war, in terms of the United States, I really wouldn't say that not like World War II, where we had dramatic changes in technology. The biggest, of course, was atomic power. We didn't see that so much in the United States. There was technological advance in the sense that industries were able, dare I say, to profit from the war in terms of helping to, sell things overseas, and eventually, when we were here, the mobilization within the United States.
Right, which leads to the economy and how it made changes in that. In America?
Well, there were significant changes in the economy during and because of the war, although not all of them continued after the war. The biggest thing about the war was, in one sense, it was a test of the extent to which you could have private and public partnerships. There was an effort to impose some kind of order on mobilization, which initially was very sloppily done. It was very erratic. And Woodrow Wilson, the president, then called Bernard Baruch, who was a stock speculator of all things, to head up a thing called the War Industries Board that basically was going to impose uniformity on the entire economy. And we also, for a period of time, took over all the railroads and telecommunications, and we set up various agencies and try to make a much more efficient transition from a domestic economy into a wartime economy to feed the men overseas and to feed our interests as well. In that regard, the economy was deeply affected by it. And of course, there were other effects as well.
How about women's rights?
Okay, well, in terms of women's rights, I mean, one of the big things that comes out of the war, there are several big things coming out of the war that affect a lot of people. One would be, of course, the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, prohibition, et cetera. But women made major contributions to the war effort. And of course, just as in the Civil War, now in World War I, the argument was that women should be fully embodied citizens. We've made the sacrifices. We've gone and worked when the men have been away. We have been patriotic in terms of the kind of service we've done and rallying and propagandizing,
They filled a lot
et
of the
cetera.
jobs that the men
They
left.
filled jobs that men left. They did, but a lot of the work they did actually was continuing to do the kind of work that they would do at home, except making the economies and these kind of things and rallying people, et cetera, and then also working in Red Cross and what have you. The point that they made in this is that we have made the sacrifices. We've shown that we're responsible citizens. Now is the time to do the last thing, and that is to ratify this amendment, which the struggle for which had been going on for some time.
Right, which gave them the right to vote.
It gave them the right to vote in terms of a federal right. I mean, women were voting in some places already. They were voting in some of the territories and some of the western states and locally, but this made it now almost a national obligation as a response to a national commitment that women had made.
Right. How about the impact on African Americans?
The effect of the war on African Americans was actually quite large. I mean, one of the big stories coming out of World War I in terms of the immediate impact and the long term was that this was probably the greatest spur to what becomes known as the Great Migration. And this is this massive movement of black and white Southerners. But when we talk about the Great Migration, we're really talking about African Americans moving out of the South and peopling places like Toledo and Detroit and Cleveland and Chicago and Milwaukee, obviously Philadelphia, the Delaware, the Lehigh Valley as well. And they were leaving the South in smaller numbers already because of the boll weevil, because of racism, because of lynching and all these sorts of things.
Right.
But now they were needed. And because they were needed, all of a sudden there would be inducements for them where they had been excluded from industries. Now, because you didn't have any immigration during the war, so there was a shortage, as companies would send information down, come and work here in Chicago. They might send tickets down. And this was also facilitated by black churches who would be sending information down. If you come to Chicago, we've got a church for you. It was black newspapers who would advertise. And this led to a significant shift of a chain migration that would grow ever larger. So they're filling jobs during the war that they would never have been able to fill before.
Right.
And now they're moving to places where they likely would not have gone, certainly in those numbers. And once that started, it built upon itself, so that all of a sudden you're going to have, and I say sudden because within 20, 30 years, this dramatic population shift that's going to continue through the 1960s of African Americans now, instead of being largely, almost wholly a Southern people, are now going to be a Midwestern people. They're going to be an Eastern Seaboard people. And eventually in World War II, they're going to become a Sunbelt people as well. And if you think about the implications of that, it means several things. I mean, one, of course, is going to mean a much more diverse population, if you will.
Right.
Not always a welcome one. There were race riots in Chicago and Detroit, did not like necessarily the black people coming up for jobs and what have you. But it also meant that the issues of civil rights were not going to be confined just to the South. Now they're going to be issues that our national issues.
Right.
And one of the other things is that blacks were empowered by this as well, because now they had some money in their pockets. They could be not just the servers, they could become the served.
Right, independent.
Independent. And what's also interesting in terms, they're buying homes or what have you, but what do you do with your disposable income? And what's interesting, they would always give it to the churches, which are the foundations of their religious selves and their social selves, but also their political selves. They would give it to organizations like the NAACP, which was the first civil rights organization that's committed to a sustained effort of gathering information and directing people to those questions, and which required money, required support. African Americans are going to have greater capacity by leaving the South than they ever had before. So African Americans served in World War I, and one of the interesting things and the dangerous thing from the white Southern point of view is they came back with some very bad ideas, because the bad ideas were they were treated differently by white people in France than they were in Mississippi or in Alabama, and they came back and with aspirations in terms of
expectations to be treated equally.
Well, or at least better.
Better.
And these were beaten down rapidly, because that's one of the things that white Southerners were concerned about, is if African Americans get other ideas than the ones that we're trying to impress on them, impose on them, then they'll become even more of a restive people. And the World War I did that, taking them out of the South, but also taking them to places where you could see there were alternative ways of being respected as a person, and thus that created expectations when you went back home.
Right. And finally, very quickly, America becomes isolated, gets into isolationism after World War I?
Well, after World War I, Americans rethought their engagement. There was a long-standing idea in the United States that we should not become entangled in European affairs because we couldn't control events and we just get sucked into it. We were never truly isolationists. We were very aggressive in the Western Hemisphere. We had interest in Pacific. We certainly traded and what have you with Europe, but we just stay out of their dynastic disputes or whatever it is. But now we were in it, and once we were in it, we expected we're going to change the world. From our perspective, this was a war to end all wars. This great war was going to be a war for democracy. But it all fell apart at Versailles because the European powers who were the victors, they weren't interested in anything magnanimous. They were going to try to get as much as they could. Yeah, get rid of those guys' empires, and we're going to take them. So there's a tremendous sense in the United States that this was a huge mistake. We sent our boys over there for what? And governments had failed, millions of people had died, economies were totally disrupted, et cetera. And the concern is not only had we gone over there almost for naught, but all the disruptions over there, the contaminations, like the Bolsheviks, et cetera, are going to come over here. And one of the things people forget is, after the war, there was the big Red Scare here, this concern about this, that all these pollutants, all these dangers from Europe are somehow invading. Communism here, anarchism here, socialism here, every kind of ism here. And grafted onto that was the thing that killed more Americans, which of course is the Great Flu epidemic, that killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, millions of people worldwide. And when Americans thought about this was almost the final proof of why you shouldn't get involved in their affairs. That they are going to infect, pollute, and kill everything. So we should chart our own way. The immediate effect of that was we did not join the League of Nations, which was going to be this agency to prevent future wars. And the lack of the United States involvement in it didn't kill it, but it certainly crippled it in many ways.
Right.
And some people say, well, that led to World War II. It didn't lead to World War II, but it certainly was a factor in making it less possible for these beleaguered democracies that were struggling after World War I in Europe to sort themselves out and fight against fascism or communism or anything. And of course, that's World War II.
We thank you, Dr. Miller, for your insights and joining us here on Focus today.
My pleasure.
Laura, back to you.
Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Focus, which is recorded at the PPL Public Media Center in Bethlehem. We'll see you next week. Until then, remember to focus on what matters.
This program is recorded at the PPL Public Media Center at PBS 39 in Bethlehem.